The book of Exodus, the second book of our Bibles, Genesis, then Exodus, sometimes referred to as the Pentateuch, a Greek word. Penta means five. Tukos is a word in the Greek referring to the scrolls, the first 5 scrolls or 5 books, the Pentateuch. Sometimes referred to as the books of Moses. Moses is the presupposed and presented as the author of these first 5 books. I will make a case for Mosaic authorship next week. In addition to the Pentateuch and the first 5 books, also sometimes known as the Torah or the Torah, a word that we sometimes translate as law. When we say law, what kind of connotation does that stir up? Like, what do you feel? Is that like a positive thing? Or is that like, oh, the law? All the do's and the don'ts, all the archaic legislation that we don't really need to worry about anymore. It was so burdensome. What do you think of when you think of the law? For Israel and the people who received it, the law was a gift. When you look at the psalmists like David in Psalm 19, the law of the Lord is perfect. It revives the soul. The testimony of the Lord is sure. It makes wise the simple. The precepts of the Lord are right. They rejoice the heart. The command of the Lord is pure. It enlightens the eyes. These words here for law, testimony, precept, command, these are all words that are used to refer to these first 5 books. And what do? They rejoice the heart. They enlighten the eyes. They make the simple wise. They revive and give life to the soul. That sounds like a pretty good thing. The psalmist continues, says, more than gold are they to be desired, even fine gold. God's commandments, they're sweeter than honey, than the drippings of honeycomb. The law is a gift. And you might be thinking, but yeah, we got books in there like Leviticus. You gonna tell me that's a gift? When you go and you read ancient rabbinical commentaries on a book like Leviticus, you'll find stories. And in these stories, you'll see one of a king. And the king would give his servants his clothes to care for it. And so he'd give them and he'd dump all his laundry on them and say, here, take care of this. But there was one particular garment that when he would give to his servants, he would give them special instructions. He would say, I want you to shake it like so. I want you to fold it in a particular way. Here's how I want you to care for it. More instructions in great detail than anything else. So one day, one of his servants gives up the nerve to address the king. He says, my lord, my king, of all the garments you give us no instructions except for this one. You give us great detail. Why is that? The king answers, because this is the garment that I wear closest to my body. It's closest to my heart. And so it is with Israel. Of all the nations, Israel receives God's detailed instruction because they are the nation, they are the people that are closest to his heart. It's a gift for God to reveal what he wants for our lives. The same positive sentiment, it carries into the New Testament. Jesus says, I tell you, not one dot or iota. In fact, if he was speaking in a Semitic background, which some scholars think he was, some of those little tick marks around the Hebrew language there, that's what he'd be referring to. He says, not even one of those will pass away until all is fulfilled. Paul in Romans 7, he says, the law, it's holy. The commandments are good and righteous. For Paul, there was not a problem with the law. The problem was with the human heart, so that the law couldn't produce the kind of people that God wanted to form and shape. We needed a greater work of the Spirit. The law is good. In fact, some would say Torah may not be best translated as law. Certainly in the narrow sense, there are legal stipulations within Torah. But some would suggest we should translate it as guidance. Torah comes from a noun of yara. You don't have to know Hebrew to figure that out. Yara, Torah. Yara is actually a verb. It has to do with archery term. And to yara is to shoot at a target with force and accuracy. So then what's Torah? Torah is the trajectory along which you want to aim your arrow to hit the mark. Torah is God's path. It's his guidance. It's his way for us to aim our lives and the trajectory of our lives towards him so we can hit the mark of what he most wants and desires for us. That's Torah. I know if we go way astray and we miss that mark, oh, that's chata. That's sin. We've missed God's best for our life. So Exodus is part of Torah, these first 5 books, God's guidance for us. It's a gift. It's sweet, more to be desired than gold. Now, the name Exodus itself comes from a Greek translation of the Bible. It only occurs 2 times in the text, Exodus 23, but for the first time in Exodus 19:1. On the 3rd day of the new moon, after the people of Israel had gone out, Exodus in Greek there, it's exodou, it means to go out. That's where the name of the book comes from in our English vernacular. But the Hebrews, they called it by something different. Sometimes for short they would call it Shemot, which is the plural of Shem, the Hebrew for name. They call it names. And it comes from the first phrase that opens up the book of Exodus. That longer phrase, that longer title they would call it is Wa'elah Shemot. And these are the names. That's how the book of Exodus starts. Now, not all of our English translations catch that and in there. It's called a vav consecutive. It means there's a story that's already in progress. But think of and. Remember the old songs? We got the teachers in here. Conjunction, junction, once your function. I'm hooking up phrases, clauses. Something came before. If you tell somebody a story, do you start with and? And so well, you can. It'd be a little awkward, but we don't. Why does Exodus start with an and? Because it's hooking things together. It's a story that's already been in progress. And the author expects us to be somewhat familiar with that story because it's picking up. So I want to open with these first 7 verses in the book of Exodus. And these are the names of the sons of Israel who came to Egypt with Jacob, each with his household: Reuben, Simeon, Levi, and Judah, Issachar, Zebulun, and Benjamin, Dan, and Naphtali, Gad, and Asher. All the descendants of Jacob were 70 persons. Joseph was already in Egypt. Then Joseph died, and all of his brothers and all of that generation. But the people of Israel were fruitful and increased greatly. They multiplied and grew exceedingly strong so that the land was filled with them. This text doesn't just continue a story that's already in progress. It expects us as good readers cooperating with the author to know things. It uses 2 names for Jacob. Did you catch that? It calls him Jacob and Israel. The author expects that we know how that happened. That goes back to the book of Genesis. But then there's more. The author is very intentional. Moses is picking his words carefully because he wants to make another point. And it's a point of hope, of encouragement, of deep trust when circumstances look like they're contrary to what God has promised. And there's a message of hope for us even today. For those of us who may feel like, you know what, I missed that mark long ago and way too many times. I think I got this thing off course. I think God's got me on the bench. I'm at an age, I don't know how much is left out here. And I feel like all I'm doing is waiting. God seems silent. there's a message in here for us. But to pick up on it and to give us more context, we have to go back to the beginning. So I want to go back and catch us up to the context when we arrive in Exodus. Because the "and" of Exodus 1:1, all of these stories of waiting, of things seeming contrary to God's promises, of frustration, of brokenness, those are all stories of the "and" before Exodus 1:1. So the story itself begins in Genesis 1:1. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Makes a beautiful creation. On day 5, he creates the animals. We want to start paying attention to some of this language. I just want to pick up on this. Sorry for the Hebrew. I just want to give us different layers. You'll be able to pick up on this in your English Bible. But it says that the creatures that they swarmed, there were so many of them. It's this word sharat. To swarm. And then God makes his human creatures. It says, and God blesses them. God says to them, I want you to be fruitful. The word is para. And I want you to multiply. Make a transliteration here. That's rava. I want you to fill. Wow. Fill the earth. This is God's plan for creation. Go, be fruitful, multiply, spread my image and my glory to the ends of the earth. And God looks at all that he does in creation. In Genesis 1, at the very end of it, he says, behold, all of it is tov me'od. This word me'od, very, exceedingly, strong. It's good. We want to pay attention to that number 7. We'll come back to these words. God creates this good creation. You know how the story goes. Humans rebel. They mess it up. But God doesn't give up. He makes a promise. And sometimes we'll call this the proto-evangelion, the first gospel in Genesis 3:15. God promises that there will come one from the woman who will be strong enough to somehow defeat the dark power. Fully human, and yet strong enough to do battle in the metaphysical realm with the power that stands behind the voice of the serpent. And it's this seed promise of this individual, of this offspring. And the rest of Genesis pays attention to this promise all the way into Exodus. Adam and Eve, they have kids. They have Cain and Abel. You think, Abel might be it. God's promises are going forth. We don't have to wait long at all. Here it is. God's going to get us back to the very good of Genesis 1 and 2. Not so. Cain kills Abel. Oh, but then we have Seth. Maybe it's going to happen through Seth. But then the line of Cain snuffs out the line of Seth until there's no one righteous except for one, and that's Noah. And that gets us to the flood. God sends a flood, saves Noah and his family, and then we get a reboot. Be fruitful, multiply. But even with the reboot, things go south until all of the nations, we have the table of nations in Genesis 10, 70 nations, all the nations of the world are rebelling against God. God comes in judgment and he scatters them. But he's still not done. It's at that point that these massive promises are made to Abraham in Genesis 12, 1 through 3. It's promises of offspring, land, and blessing. Abraham, I'm going to give you a land. I'm going to give you a people. I'm going to put you at the center of the world at that time. You're going to follow my Torah, and it's going to be so good and beautiful that all the nations will see and they'll return to me. That's the plan. Abraham at this time is about 75 years old. Got a little wear and tear on him, but he's doing all right. So at this point, him and his wife Sarah, they begin to journey on. There's a famine that hits the land. So in this journey, during this famine, they go down to Egypt. But Abraham, he's kind of thinking, man, I don't know if God's got this thing all worked out or what, but we're going to get down there. And he says to his wife, he goes, Sarah, you've kind of got it going on. He says, you're beautiful in appearance. Or you could translate it one way of, you're a phenomenon. I think that's a pretty good translation. I think that would work. There you go, husbands, that one's for free. And he was right. So Abraham says, why don't you tell him you're my sister? That way, they'll leave us alone. They do it. Pharaoh takes Sarah into his house, and then God sends plagues. He says, nuh-uh, that's not how it's going to happen. There's a seed promise that's in risk here. And so Pharaoh gives them all kinds of gifts, sends them on their way. Now, did Abraham make a mistake? Yes. But in this story of ups and downs, God's faithfulness is stronger than human failure. The plan isn't off track. And God shows up to him again in Genesis 15, verses 1 through 4. And he reiterates some of these promises. After these things, the word of the Lord came to Abraham in a vision. Fear not, Abram, I am your shield. Your reward shall be very great. But Abram says, O Lord, what will you give me? For I continue childless, and the heir of my house is Eliezer of Damascus. And Abraham said, Behold, you have given me no offspring, and a member of my household will be my heir. And behold, the word of the Lord came to him. This man shall not be your heir, but your very own son shall be. Moses is saying, we've got problems. You told me we're going to have this land, but the land is occupied. I have no people, so there's no way we're kicking them out. Oh, and there was another problem that I forgot to mention. Back in Genesis 11, we're told that Sarah is barren. If God is going to fulfill this promise of a seed of offspring, he's going to have to overcome the impossible. And Moses says, where's my children? God says, you're going to have a child. And by the way, at this point, Abraham's pushing 85. The text moves pretty close, doesn't it? It's like, oh, he didn't have to wait long. 10 years. It's a very long time. And then in 17:6, he says, you're going to be exceedingly fruitful. Abraham, I'm going to multiply you. You're going to be exceedingly fruitful. That language starts to sound familiar again? God hasn't given up on his promises. But they get to a point where they think, yeah, it has been a good 10 years, and God says it's going to come from our own son, but maybe we should take this thing into our own hand. Genesis 16. Sarah says, why don't you go ahead and take my servant, have a child with her, that way we'll fulfill this promise of having offspring. That's how God's going to do this thing. We've got this, Abraham. He does it. They have Ishmael. Causes all sorts of chaos and strife. It was not God's plan. God comes to him again in Genesis 17. Says, no, that's not how it's going to work. Abraham, it's going to be through Sarah. She's the one who's going to give you a child. So even with this other specific promise of it happening through Sarah, they get into another situation. They travel to the land of Gerar now and King Abimelech. Same thing, recapitulation of the sin. Let's tell him you're my sister. Sure enough, King Abimelech sees Sarah. Apparently she is aging better than Abraham is. Thinks she's a beauty, takes her. God says to Abimelech, you're a dead man, let her go. Protects her, protects the seed promise. Finally, we get to Genesis 21. Abraham's 99, now 100. Isaac is born from Sarah. God has fulfilled his promise. How many years did that take? 25 years from when God made the promise to when the promise is fulfilled. So despite barrenness, human sin, impatience, all of these things, God's promise and grace are not thwarted. The covenant continues through Isaac. The promises get passed on to him. Genesis 26. I'm going to give you offspring. I'm going to give you this land. Hear these two things? Land and offspring. They're coming to the forefront again. I'm going to multiply you. Ravah. Hear the terminology? You may think, wow, at this point, I think it's going to be smooth sailing. God's going to finally straight line this thing and move it forward. Not so fast. He continues the same sin and to mirror the sins of his ancestors and his family. So Isaac, he meets Rebekah. Isaac and Rebekah give birth to Jacob and Esau. Esau is the older son. He's the likely choice. He's skilled. He's strong. Jacob is the weaker one. Jacob hoodwinks his brother Esau, then deceives his own father, and he receives the blessing. And yet, in the midst of that, God's plan is still being carried out. And in Genesis 28, the covenant promises get reaffirmed to Jacob. Your offspring shall be like the dust of the earth, and you shall spread abroad to the west and to the east and to the north and to the south. And in you, in your offspring, shall all the families of the earth be blessed. Recognize those promises from Genesis 12? Behold, I am with you. The heart of the promise. God is going with him. Even in the midst of all this, God is still working through Jacob. His name gets changed to Israel, but the story continues to be one of dysfunction, one of deception. Jacob falls in love with a girl named Rachel. He wants to marry her, but Rachel's dad deceives Jacob. So he ends up marrying Leah, then marries Rachel and Leah. Creates, again, all sorts of chaos and strife. But the two of them now have 12 sons. And these 12 sons become the 12 tribes of Israel. Out of human strife, God is quietly shaping his human people. It's still happening. But the story turns even darker. Out of the 12 sons, number 11 of the 12 is Joseph. Now Joseph, he's a young man. Presumably he's smart from late in the story, but in his young years, maybe not so much. He has a vision. And he has a vision that his brothers are going to bow down to him. Now, if anybody has boys, you know the one thing you're not going to do is you're not going to share that kind of vision with your older brothers, because that's going to go over like a lead balloon. And sure enough, he shares it with them. And what do? Oh, that's great. Sure, we will. No. They beat him, leave him for dead, but then they decide to sell him into slavery. They deceive their father and say, hey, Joseph's dead. Now, Joseph's life at about this time, he's about 17 years old. And his life has these twists and turns, and this vision that he thought was going to play out for his life goes every direction but the way he thought it was going to go. It's not till later, when he's about 30, that vision is realized. And all these false starts, being forgotten, false accusations, being betrayed, he's put second in command to Pharaoh. And it's at that point in the story, a little bit later, now at about age 39, his brothers come back to Egypt because there's a famine. And Joseph protects them. Says, y'all meant that for evil, God meant it for good. But we have a people now who are in Egypt. And those brothers are all back together now. The 12 tribes of Israel are in Egypt. And you know what they're doing? They're being fruitful and they're multiplying. So by the time we get to the end of Genesis and the beginning of Exodus, guess what we have? We've got offspring. We have a people. God's promises are going forward. You know what we don't have? No land yet. But this is where we pick up now, back in Exodus 1. We've got a people. This has been an up and down path, but God has gotten us there. Listen to the language again of Exodus 1:1-7. And these are the names of the sons of Israel who came to Egypt with Jacob, each with his household: Reuben, Simeon, Levi, and Judah; Issachar, Zebulun, Benjamin, Dan, and Naphtali; Gad, and Asher. And all the descendants of Jacob were 70 persons. Joseph was already in Egypt. Then Joseph died, and all his brothers and all that generation. But the people of Israel were fruitful and increased greatly. They multiplied and grew exceedingly strong, so that the land was filled with them. Do you notice that language at number 70? That's intentional. There was the 70 nations of Genesis 10, of which God is responding to in Genesis 12, to reverse the sin of the nations, to call the one family, the one nation of Israel, to bless the nations. It's happening now through the 12 tribes that are now in Egypt. But did you catch the language? Be fruitful, multiply, increase greatly. If you translate this from the Hebrew, there's 7 different words here, active verbs. Parah, to be fruitful. Sharatz, they teamed. Atzam, they grew mightily. Me'od and me'od, strongly, exceedingly, so that the land was filled with them. Do you recognize that language? Have we heard that before? That's the language of Genesis 1, of creation. God has not given up on his creation account. And there's 7 words, 7 verbs. Why? Because there are 7 days of creation. It is through Israel, the chosen people, that God has never given up on his plan. Despite all the twists and the turns and everything that's happened, it is still on course. He's getting us back to the very good of Genesis 1 and 2, and even better. But I could have saved you a whole lot of time this morning, couldn't I? I could have said, you know what, we're in Exodus, and here's the cool thing. Here's what the author does. He echoes Genesis 1 to let us know this is a new act of creation that's happening in the book of Exodus. Why did I take you through all this? Because there's something else about that number 7. It's the number of harmony, the number of completion, the number of perfection. One Hebrew scholar says it this way: harmonious perfection is implied here, with the object of teaching us that all that happened was brought about by the will of God in conformity with his predetermined plan. All the false starts, all the mess ups, all the mistakes, all the betrayal, all the testing, the crisis, all the God working things out, entering into the impossible, that was all part of God's plan. He could have taken them in a straight line, A to B. He doesn't. It's this. This is God's plan. This is his modus operandi. This is how he works. So I don't know what's touched your story. But if you're one of those, it's like, yeah, that sounds about right. The word of hope, you're not off course. God's faithfulness is stronger. He's got you exactly where he wants you. And whatever you're facing right now, whatever season you've been in or going through, what's our response? To aim our trajectory of our lives according to his word and let God work things out. The name that gets revealed, the title of God in Exodus, is El Shaddai, God Almighty. It's the God who moves into impossible situations and powerfully intervenes and makes things possible again. That's El Shaddai. He did it then. He can do it again. And we'll trust him for it. And Israel is going to have to trust him for it, because they are about to face an impossible situation. In verse 8, we read, "And there rose a new king in Egypt, a new Pharaoh who did not know Joseph." Uh-oh. We've got a problem. Things are about to get serious. In fact, we're gearing up for a battle. See, another thing about these names that are listed, when you look at them and you look at other ancient documents, you know what they have the resemblance of? A war scroll, a military roster. God's gearing up for something. And it's about to be a battle of cosmic proportions that involves heaven and earth. Not just the earthly realm, but the heavenly. And we're about to see more than El Shaddai. We're about to see the great I am and what he can do. But that's next week. So now, as we depart, may the Lord bless you and keep you. May he make his face shine upon you and be gracious to you. May he turn his face towards you and give you his shalom and his peace, keeping your whole spirit, soul, and body blameless until the coming of our Lord Jesus Christ. He who has called you is faithful, and he will surely do it. Amen, and I'll see you next week.